we go. Well, thank you, Kelly, for joining us. My name is Eddie. I use they, them pronouns, and I am one of the educators with SafeLink Alberta. Um, we have with us Kelly, who is from SWAN Vancouver, a big partnership or a big partner of ours, and also a big fan of Kelly and the work that you folks do. So we're super excited to have Kelly here to chat a little bit with us. And I have questions, but I know that our folks who are attending may also have questions. So would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more, Kelly?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kelly. My pronouns are she, her, and Swan, Vancouver. I'm today, my office too is situated on the stolen and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And Swan promotes the health rights and safety of migrant sex workers through frontline services and systemic efficacy. Our frontline services, we have basically three core programs, so outreach and then online outreach and also a peer program.
Thank you. For those who aren't aware, SafeLink was founded and continues to operate on Treaty 7 territory, southern Alberta, home to the Niitsitapi, Kainai, and Pagani, as well as the Tsuut'ina and the Iahe Nakota, um, as well as Métis District 6. We, especially when we're talking about um, sex work and themes that are heavily morally influenced, it's important that we talk about how those morals got established um, as a country that was colonized and continues to feel the effects of Christian colonization, and how specifically those Christian morals were um, forced upon Indigenous communities here, but also those continued the continued impacts of how we view what is ethical and moral, especially around sex. Um, so we're here today to talk about um, sex work and um, the impacts of some of those misconceptions or stigmas that sex workers face. So, um, Kelly, can you tell us what you believe would be important for the general public to know about the difference between sex work and sex trafficking?
Yeah, so sex work is the consensual exchange of sexual services between adults. Sex work is not inherently dangerous, but it really the context that we're in create vulnerabilities, whether it's like political, legal, and social. And I really appreciate the land acknowledgement that you did because I feel like from this conversation too, we're gonna talk about this whole definition of belonging, who is worthy, who is unworthy, this whole notion of victimhood too. And I think right
Mhm.
now, with the conflation of sex workers and trafficking, it's also touching on the conversation of migration and mobility for racialized folks. And this conflation of sex work and trafficking, it's not an accident, it's not a misunderstanding of terminology, but really a conscious effort to abolish sex work and also to prevent people, in particularly racialized folks, from even migrating to do sex work. And we see that in like trafficking regulations, but also in our immigration laws as well. And especially for migrant, because in Canada, you actually, under the immigration law, it said it's illegal for people who are not Canadian citizen or permanent residents to do sex work. And oftentimes trafficking would be used as a reason to do investigation on the work that these folks are doing. So and I can share more about kind of the harms and the impact of this conflation. And first, I mean, we've been talking about like racism, and race is at the heart of all the work that SWAN does. And we emphasize is that on top of anti-sex work, racism, anti-migrant sentiment, um, all of these isms and sentiments cannot be viewed as isolated from one another, because Canada is a nation state that's built upon white supremacy, which we're still seeing in the very fabric of our society, including like our immigration law, including our like trafficking laws and trafficking campaign. And so we see like white saviorism, and for trafficking raids and policies, it's really all of these work are being done in the name of protection, but we're asking like what and for whom is the government trying to protect? It's and with this kind of in the name of protection, essentially, it's exclusionary immigration laws on sex work, keeping like the undesirable out from mainstream society. There's also increased surveillance because of the assumption that a group of racialized people working together, it can be seen as a sign of trafficking, which I know we'll talk a little bit more later on the red flags of trafficking. There's also like a lot of checklists being created to identify victims of trafficking. And all of these checklists are based on racist and sexist assumptions on people in general. Um, and like when SWAN first started in 2004, Asian sex workers were the quintessential trafficking victims. Like there are many stories out there, including movies that talk about how Asian women are being trafficked. And then slowly we see how this discourse really changed into like um trafficking's happening in your backyard. You have to watch out for it. It can happen to you, your kids, everyone else. It can happen like I saw one crazy thing about like it's happening like within 1 kilometer of where you're living. Like so it's also kind of questioning how these like sensationalized, like made up, unfounded stats or statement came from, because I think um, a lot of anti-trafficking campaigns are targeting people who probably have good intention, but are not really mindful of where these stats or like these statements are coming from. They just want to help, but it's this mentality that I think a lot of trafficking campaign are benefiting from. So it's also super important to like check where those stats, where those statements are coming from, and just kind of, is it based on like racist infantilizing moral panic about newcomers or migrant workers coming to work? Like are these campaign, or people are just out there looking for victims where it's where bad things are not happening. Um, I know I've been speaking a lot, but I also really want to add how like the anti-trafficking movement and the sex work movement have been pitted against one another. But it's so important to know that sex workers, sex work support organizations are actually contributing to ending exploitation. Uh, and sex workers have been contributing to ending exploitative workplace practices. They have been pushing back, promoting safer working condition, access to justice for sex workers. And also, I think community organizations, sex workers among themselves have already built trust in the community, but then no one's are getting enough funding to continue on this important work. And at the same time, when these two movements are being pitted against one another, like resources are also being wasted to look for victims where there aren't. Um,
Hmm.
and also oppressions are all connected. There's no separation. Like we're also saying that yes, trafficking happens, exploitations happen, but those raids, rescue are not the way to go. It's about building community partnerships and relationships and building trust so that when bad things happen, people know that there's an organization or someone that they could go to create to access person-centered sex work supportive support.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think, um, especially in the age or the time where the Canadian Alliance for Sex Worker Law Reform is pushing um, against the law that is in place in Canada. For those who don't know, um, the current laws are we have our human trafficking laws and our exploitation laws, and then we have our um, protected communities and exploited persons act. And that act specifically targets sex workers. And what the Canadian Alliance for Sex Worker Law Reform is pushing for is I'm going to submit the link for folks who want to check out their website for more information, but pushing to specifically uh, bring awareness to the differences between those two laws. And again, like you mentioned, that sex workers are allies in identifying exploitation um, rather than rather than these being opposing forces. I know in times where there is active pushing against the laws, there's a lot of media coverage that gets very the language that they use, and I think you touched on it a little when you say that um, there's a lot of intentional confusion about the language that's being used that um, doesn't always clarify the difference between sex work and sex trafficking. For example, using the term sex trade, um, and people not really knowing those key differences. And you mentioned a checklist that authorities are kind of looking for. Um, can you talk more about what you think the people who are seeking to end exploitation versus and work with sex workers who are allies in identifying that, um, what they might need to know about how those checklist items are not always accurate when they're trying to identify sex trafficking? That was
Yeah.
a long, weird question.
No, no, no. I got it. I think again, all of these checklists we have to be really mindful of. Not only again, they use really like weird language. I think there's a lot of co-optation of terms like intersectional feminism, all of that. I think I see a lot of weird framing around like red flags and just trafficking campaigns in general. But like trafficking red flags or indicators and trainings have been like increasing among everybody, not just police, not just Canada Border Services agencies, but honestly, like healthcare providers, hotel, taxi driver, hairdresser, everybody. And they always include very vague, overbroad, racist red flags that can apply to basically anyone in the society. Um, and these red flags, these awareness campaigns does not cover is the complex interplay of gender, race, ethnicity, language, and culture. And it's not really the person who create the red flags that it's trying to apply to. Like they're seeing the red flags according to, okay, I think that this person is trafficked, therefore I'm creating these red flags to reflect that. So like for example, some of the red flags we see are like um a group of non-white Asian sex workers who speak other language working together. That situation can be seen as trafficking. But then at the same time, if people are seeing that a group of Canadian-born or English-speaking sex workers working together, these like trafficking indicators are not being applied to this group. So it's being applied very selectively. And then there's also one that we actually encounter a lot because we provide accompaniment along with translation to health appointments. And one of the common red flag is about if someone is speaking on the other person's behalf and that person doesn't speak English, that can be a red flag. But for us, what we're seeing is there's language barrier. If they're new to the country, they're also working with a completely new healthcare system, so they need someone to accompany them. And and then for our experience, we've actually gotten questions about who we are. The woman that we support got like this weird support card about like where to seek help, like things like that. And so we also see how if there's just one bad experience at a healthcare system, it's likely that this person is not going to go back. So that's also impact people's access to social services. And again, like if there's like a government website, maybe I can share it with you, Eddie, later about like the ridiculous red flags that there are, because I was actually going over them the other day with my coworker and we were just laughing because there's things about if you have a group of new friends, if it's just ridiculous. Like I don't understand how that can actually be on an official document. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the ones I saw was like applies for um a new identification documentation. Um and I'm just that just happens all the time.
Yeah.
Um so some of these red flags um are very broad and like you said are used very specifically on very specific people. Um I know that in the in Alberta, many of the recent media coverage or many of the this quintessential trafficked victim being um, Asian immigrant women. Um, Many of the people who might be deemed those quintessential um, or stereotypical traffic victims work in massage parlors here in Alberta. Based on your experiences working with clients, um, what does employment look like with those massage parlors, and um, how does I think particularly the fear um, of stigma or misconception affect those employees?
Yeah. Um, so we do outreach too in Vancouver and in a lot of cities around the Lower Mainland, and we've also visited Calgary not too long ago. From our experience, first, like not everyone working in the massage parlor are sex workers or identify as a sex workers or provide sexual services, but because of assumptions going around about, oh, everybody working in massage parlors are doing something else, like, that kind of mentality, I think, impacts everyone working in massage parlors, and they don't respect people's agency of how they want to identify. But I would say, really, from my experience doing outreach, I do see how it's it's really women are like everyone else running a business. Oftentimes we go to deliver like Lunar New Year gifts, safer sex supplies, lube, PPE. They're always like excited to see us. We would probably sometimes we would have conversations about access to healthcare, and when in situations where people bring up issues at work, it's not about trafficking, it's not about exploitation. It's about like labor related topics, like labor rights issue, but then there's no framework currently that they can talk about labor rights issue without people thinking that it's trafficking. Because we simply, I think the dominant system we have currently just don't allow for that, because sex work is criminalized. And we have had women who share with us their concern about um, what do we do if police or bylaws come? We can't actually show our ID for various different reasons. We have had women share with us that they've been interrogated by law enforcement because of anti-trafficking rescue operation. And in many situations, they only have two options. It's either they denounce their work, like they say, okay, I actually don't want to do our work here, and identify themselves as a victim of exploitation or traffic. And then the other option is if they're saying that, okay, I am doing this work consensually, then they're flipped into a criminal. So it's also being kind of forced to identify as either a victim or criminal. Again, it's a stereotypical kind of assumption, like racist assumptions being put on this community. And then also for many years, this trafficking victim was framed as the other, as like this easily tricked racialized woman who have been lured and trafficked to Canada. So when they're saying no, that's not who I am, when they're trying to assert their agency, that's when investigation of like immigration started to come in. And we also work with a lot of women who might be single parent, um, and who might be teachers who are doing work that if sex work came out, maybe that could bring like backlash. If someone has kids, what if the ministry got involved? So there's a lot of things that are constantly going through people's mind. And the other thing too is, quite frankly, there is simply no safe way to criminal justice for migrant sex workers and immigrant sex workers, because of the various layer of criminalization. And I'm speaking kind of just with the community that we work with the most. We also make a distinction between immigrant and migrant sex workers because privilege are relational, and for us immigrant are people with a more like permanent status, so like for example permanent residents or Canadian citizen. um and then for migrant sex workers, we're referring to people who are here maybe more like temporarily with visitor visa, work permit, international student visa. But then again, relatively speaking, someone who is an immigrant sex worker might not encounter like deportation. I mean, their PR can still be revoked if they were charged with a serious criminal offense, but compared with someone who is here with a migrant status, deportation is the most like significant, like the most terrible thing that could happen, like in a situation like a trafficking rate. I just want to throw that in there.
Yeah. And I know in particular this victim and savior mentality is um I mean, quite frankly, very much undervaluing, in particular, women's ability to critical think and have autonomy. And um, but it very clearly is a tactic that's used, especially if you have the guts to read um, any of the court documentation um, for law reform. A lot of the language carries this very clear savior victim mentality um, that completely frames, especially immigrant women, as just unable to think for themselves. Um, and like you said, it's often either a victim mentality or a criminal, um, or a being seen as a victim in eyes of the law versus a criminal. So, um, including, I guess, that mentality. Um, let's talk a little bit more about that impact on in particular immigrant sex workers, um, and the impact of those stigmas, as well as some of the barriers that you've already mentioned to things like accessing care,
Mhm.
and support.
Yeah. Um, so I I also want to touch a little bit on this whole white saviorism too, because I just always want to connect it to Canada's long history and continuation of colonial oppression, because that is really the foundation of what we're talking about today. It is racialized control of movement and freedom, and we're seeing it continue to be legitimized in laws and policies under this justification of protection and that people need saving. And that's also where all these policies are coming from, because like the immigration protection of sex work, like why are you singling out one industry? Um,
Mhm.
but that the impact on immigrant and migrant sex workers, again, like I mentioned about no safe way to criminal justice system, and I can also share kind of one example too. I think it's a very powerful example because this person um, has experienced exploitation, and it's someone that we've supported a while back, and all she wanted to do is to get out of that exploitative of situation and continue to do sex work. However, to get out of that exploitative of situation, this person had to actually call the police because, for one, it is a dangerous situation where we cannot really intervene as a nonprofit. But so what ended up happening was it was a trafficking investigation. However, a lot of the things that happened between in terms of getting support was so terrible. For once, this person cannot access any shelter or like trafficking shelter because of language barriers. There's also this lockdown procedure for safety. And so for us, we're asking, why are you putting people who are coming out from a bad situation to continue to get like have their power over like controlling where they want to be taken away from
Mm.
them. And at the same time, this person told us that they just want to continue to do sex work, but shelters are not open to that. So um, we're also seeing how sure, like all those trafficking campaigns and awareness of racing trafficking awareness campaign, like okay, then what? Like if someone actually was in a terrible situations, what do we do? There's no considerations into people's like various different intersections and centering what they needs in the aftermath of coming out from a bad situation. At the same time, for this person, we always say that in the work that we do, everything is based on luck. If we're lucky that day that we got a reasonable police officer, we got a reasonable immigration officer who actually gave us an approval for a temporary residence permit that is known to be very difficult to obtain. And we were really lucky that day that we got a really good rate to put this person in a hotel so they can work safely. And but it shouldn't be this way. And then at the same time, we've also supported women who simply want to report on things like robbery, but then police ended up using anti-trafficking, like trafficking laws to investigate the work that they do. And also throughout that process, we actually have supported a lot of people who wanted to report on violence but got deported themselves. And because police wanted to investigate trafficking, trafficking was not happening. And so then they were like, okay, then you're working here illegally. That's it. Whatever that bad that had happened to you doesn't matter. And so we're also creating a situation where perpetrators also know that they can do this with relatively impunity, and that they can also use threat of immigration deportation to to sex workers. And so it's really a vicious cycle. Laws that we have today are not benefiting sex workers, are not benefiting anyone because they're spending resources to look for trafficking at where in situations where it's not happening, and at the same time when there's actually a terrible situation that's going on, the care that's come after it, it's not something that community are asking for. uh, the trafficking framework does not care for complexities. it only wants binaries, and that's just so harmful. And I think similar mentalities can be seen not just trafficking, but probably in many different um uh like social like community support too. Um and then again, I mentioned about the difficulties in accessing healthcare services. The gap of accessing healthcare services in general is really big. I mean, in BC, and I'm assuming probably in other provinces too, especially for people who might be here with precarious status or no status, who are doing sex work, and with healthcare professionals being trained to identify traffic victims, that also can lead into situations like the care that they're asking for is not being provided because the focus is being put on whether or not you're trafficked, whether or not you're being forced to work, who is the support worker here with you, is are they actually a support worker or are they your trafficker? Like things like that really take again the attention away from the person. It's not person centered anymore because you're not listening to anything that they are saying. You're just
Mhm.
kind of trying to apply all of these training, all of these trafficking like campaigns or red flags on this person. So people are also being dehumanized because they're being reduced into the stereotypes that where people are being taught to look at the other.
Mhm. And there I know, our case manager for our shift program at SafeLink being, our program, to support sex workers, um, mentioned the other day that they were reading um, a study in general, identification of exploitation, and that labor exploitation in agriculture industries is far more um, far more pertinent or popular. And so for many people, the shift away from the specifically targeting sex trafficking and leaning into really robustly identifying actual labor and exploitation laws. And again, the expertise in terms of how that will affect sex workers is present. They're in court arguing these things. But in particular, when it comes to um, our clients that we work with, we at SafeLink have multiple um, clientele. And while this is certainly not true for all sex workers, for some folks, the stigma as well, you mentioned how different intersections um, of identities might similarly be stigmatized for our clients who might be doing sex work as well as using substances. The like requirement that they quit using their substances or that their substances um, get criminalized, even just in accessing support, that intersection becomes a barrier. Um, do you want to speak to a few more of those types of intersections? Substance use is just the one that SafeLink um, is prepared to support. Um, but other intersections that might create some of those unique needs that sex workers or those unique barriers that sex workers experience.
Yeah, I don't know. Immediately I just thought about being a parent. Like if we're talking about
Mm.
that always, I feel like, other than like immigration status, race, sex working status, but their identity of being a parent, I think it's always there because the fear of being split up with your child or just losing your child to the ministry, I think is very real. Um, who have had supported people who, again, like they were a single parent, um, the ministry has already been alerted. They cannot let their sex work status come out. And that also means that a lot, even the support that she could access, she can't go to mainstream support services. She can't go to mainstream like immigration settlement agencies because people will ask about the work that she does. So she only feels safe to access SWAN because
Mm,
she that she can talk like openly share with us what she's going through, the potential services that she could safely access without needing to share about her work. And at the same time, she cannot tell people that she's accessing Swan. So there's like layers of
mhm.
patients that they need to go through. Um, and then the other thing too is COVID. When COVID first started, we had our what was it called? Like a fund for immigrant and migrant sex workers because many of them are not eligible for the um,
Right.
I don't even remember the name of it, but it was during COVID. So we are giving out grant funding to women because a lot of them were out of work. And there are also people who told us that, oh, I cannot accept money from you because what if my other social worker asks me about where these money are coming from? And then what do I say? They either would assume that I'm working, or if I say that I got it from a support organization, they ask what support organization, then what do I do? So it's it also means that they have to be very mindful of the support and services that they're getting. And it's it's just so terrible, like especially when in a time where we probably need support the most, not to mention like isolation too, because um one example is we have a peer program, and a lot of the activities we host were on site. And at the beginning, people have been telling us that, oh, I don't know if I can come to your office. And are there cameras around? Are there police presence? So it's every day that they're faced with this precarity of if I step out of my home today, if I get street checked and I'm here working, doing sex work, but I don't have status. If they get street checked, then what happened? Like they can get deported, and that had happened before. And also, like community often share with other people about what happened. So if one person has experienced that, then I'm sure everybody knows and will know that they have to be extra careful. Can I actually safely wait for a bus or go on a taxi today? Because if I'm in the car and like we get stopped, police can actually ask to check ID for both people. Like how how can they protect themselves when there's so much unknown? And again, everything that even Swan for us do, in many situations it's so dependent on like luck, and it's just so sad because again it speaks to that no one has control over what's going to happen. And I also think like one kind of intersecting factors too is culture. We support mostly East Asian folks, so like from China, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and I think in general, probably similar to many different culture, sex work is simply not something that people can openly talk about. And there's also even within like a lot of anti-Asian racism work that's being done, sex workers are being left out because no one wants to talk about sex. And so even internally within the community, it's a difficult topic to have a genuine conversations to talk about like how to create support and services that really is person-centered to that person to without any stigma being attached to it. And oftentimes it hurt more when the harm comes from within your community. So um culture-wise too, it also means that isolation is a big issue because some of the people we support don't want to see other sex workers because what if they know them? Um, they're trying to not have sex work be a thing that's known within her community. with her friends. So that also means that sometimes they don't even want to access our services, just the fear that they might encounter someone that they have already known.
Yeah, that anticipated fear, the fear um, of potential stigma is one of the things that our clients often identify, especially in regards to accessing healthcare. And um, there is a common phenomenon amongst many um, marginalized communities where you attempt to access healthcare for a certain thing, but that appointment becomes all about your identity, your work. And for disabled Albertans who are trying to access regular healthcare, which is already difficult, um, if the appointment then becomes a lot about their work, they're not getting the care that they need because of the focus that it's put on. Um, I do want to acknowledge that we are 40 minutes into our hour-long session. If there are people who have questions from um, from the people attending today um, that you have for Kelly, please do submit your questions through the chat, and I will help to get them answered. Um, Otherwise, are there some I think especially in media, are there some are I'm flipping the red flags conversation on its head a bit and seeing if there is a way that we can identify some red flags of people who are trying to advertise or um say that they're trying to stop trafficking, um but really there's this secret goal to get to also attack sex workers. Do you see a common language or common phrases that those campaigns use?
That's a really good question. I'm thinking about it. Again, like I see that there's just this really scary co-optation of languages where it's really difficult to identify. Um,
It's very subtle, I think,
yeah, because too, like you said, a lot of them are trying to switch into using this term labor trafficking.
right?
Uh, and I need to think about that.
I
I mean,
know that I know that you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of like it's in your backyard
mm,
scare, kind of like scare tactics, and I think
uh,
there's a lot of those like
yeah.
as a community, we need to look out for each other, and they're using truths to scare
Yeah.
a lot of folks into believing that it's something that they need to be looking out for.
Yeah, a lot of things about like less than 1 kilometer away from where you live, someone is being trafficked. Average age of victim first being trafficked is 12 to 14. That's
Oh, right.
out already. And even like the government of Ontario had put it on their website about this is not correct. Like it's not. And then like the other thing too is about I think that stats it's being used interchangeably with like the average age of entry to the sex industry being 12 to 14. But where that stats actually come from, it's from a study that only youth sexual exploitation. So everybody who is part of that studies by default are under 18, but then a lot of the organizations or these campaigns are using that stats to say that as if the entire sex industry can be a representative of by that stats, which is not true. And then um I think when you see stats like that, you know that they probably are anti-sex work and like kind of weaponizing this abolish sex trade to um use it to find traffic victims, but then reality, they just want to get rid of sex work.
Yeah.
And I have some notes here because our ED did kind of a similar like a presentation, but one really important thing is over the span of the past 12, now 13 years, well, last 12 years, there's only 94 prosecuted cases of trafficking in Canada. And then um the other piece too is um in 2017, the Canadian government actually did an evaluation of Canada's National Action Plan to combat human trafficking. And then there are a lot of findings that are really important. It literally said, quote unquote, there are limited reliability and accurate data sources on to map out the scope and nature of human trafficking in Canada, making it difficult for policymakers to implement effective federal responses to human trafficking, and that the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking had a limited contribution to the investigation and prosecution of human trafficking crimes. Um, Potential victims and Canadian citizens do not have access to a dedicated mechanism for accessing services or reporting suspected cases of trafficking. And so I think it's speaking a lot from a government release evaluation of what they're trying to do. But again, none of these are being highlighted because it doesn't speak to the trafficking industry. It is an industry because so much money are being pumped into it. Um,
Hmm.
it kind of this whole thing where it has gotten so big, so many people are involved, so much money is being put there. What do people do now? If
Hmm.
now they're saying that, okay, what we're doing is actually really problematic. Is it too late to stop? Not. We're saying that it's not, but I think for them, they think it is because that's just their reality.
Hmm. Yeah, I know a lot of the language um, used in politics, the common themes being, um, family values and making um, this concern or this moral panic around our children. And there's a lot of intersections when it comes to racism as well as transphobia and homophobia when it comes to those kinds of messages. Um, I also know there's a lot of misconception around um, third party laws and this concept of a pimp in trafficking situations. Um, so and especially in terms of the racist connotations when we think of pimps and who those folks are, who is actually criminalized for it, um, and again how those third party laws are actually not doing what they're intended to do. Do you want to speak more about the misconception of that
Yeah.
particular law?
And I can share an example because it also flipped this whole who should be a perpetrator, like this
Right.
because our experience was when we were supporting someone kind of leaving this exploitative of situation, the perpetrator was an Asian woman, and police did not want to investigate because they were telling us, oh, it's a money dispute. Swan and the woman just deal with it. But we're like, no, like, what are you talking about? And we have to advocate for ourselves for the police to be involved and with the woman consent. Like, the woman also wanted to report this to the police because it's like money being withheld, being forced to work long hours, couldn't leave the workplace. It's a lot of these things that are happening where a nonprofit organization, we want to help, but it's also out of like, we also are talking about safety concern. Um, and so police didn't want to do anything about it because I think it's this assumption of who the perpetrator should be. And again, it's racist because if it's a man, it's racist and sexist if it's a man, I'm sure they're going to just jump onto it. But then they realize that it's not, it doesn't fit this stereotype, then we actually had to advocate for ourselves for once to get the police involved. Um, and it was just very, very traumatizing because, like, how are you not listening to anything that this person is saying? You said you wanted to look for traffic victims. You would drop everything to do your trafficking rates and investigation, but now we're saying that, here, can you support this person? No, 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 they can't right now because it's a money dispute. And
Mm.
I also think that in other situations, um, managers or third parties can actually be a safety mechanism for a lot of people. Drivers, we also know from our experience that sometimes these people actually share our resources to workers. Again, I think it just speaks to that you can never put someone in a binary. Like, you can't say, okay, this person has to be a victim, this person has to be a criminal. If they say no to whatever, then it's the other thing. How does that actually work? Like, and when someone actually needs support, you're not going to do your job? Like, I don't even, I don't know. I mean, I know, but how can that
Yeah.
be?
And it is so tricky to identify because there a lot of this language is laced in truths. We do want to protect community and we do want to keep people out of exploitative situations or support people out of exploitative situations. And we do care about children and and all of these things. And so it that binary I think is often used um if we support sex workers' right to choose and autonomy, it means that we don't value this, that, or the other thing. Um, and I think so many sex workers being really key identifiers in exploitative situations, it's very clear that people care and that people are multifaceted and nuanced and not just this binary. Um, we're coming up on our hour. Is there anything else you want to add to the conversation that we haven't talked about yet?
Um, Yeah, I want to share this quote because it's actually from Empower Foundation. It's a sex work led organizations that, and they do a lot of work, that critical work on anti-trafficking. And one of the quote that they have been sharing in their reports, this report is older now, is they're saying how migrant sex workers, racialized sex workers are being forced, this is a quote, to live with the modern lie that border controls, anti-trafficking policies are for their protection. None of them believe that lie and this kind of protection, because people have been spied on, arrested, cut off from their family, have their saving confiscated, interrogated in prison, and placed into the hands of men with guns in order for them to send them back home, all in the name of protection against trafficking. It's rubbing salt to the wound that is called helping. They're grateful for those who are genuinely concerned with about their welfare. They're asking people to listen to them and think in new ways of what this all actually means. And I think it's really powerful because it really kind of flip it into, like, how can you just send us home, or like confiscated our earnings, like survey us, arrested us, and then say that this is for protection. Again,
Mhm.
it's like, what are they trying to protect, right? It's what you talk about before, about this um white colonial, kind of moralistic assumptions being put on communities.
Mhm. That is a very powerful quote. I'm glad you shared.
I can put some of these in the link because I also want, like, it's a really great report that they did, and I don't want to just like steal from them. And I put the link here in the quote as well. Oh, and then one thing I want to add, I know we have 4 minutes.
Mm.
All of the things that I've talked about today, there are a lot of great work that has been done. It's not from like I've read a lot of different things that people have done research on, people have shared their thoughts about, and I'm really just repeating what a lot of people have already said. And SWAN actually created a critical anti-trafficking repository. So I'm gonna share the link in the chat, and you will be able to see like there are a lot of different resources, not just like reading materials, because they can get super overwhelming, and I know like with reading I sometimes can't focus. There are also like videos, um quite a lot of videos that I think it's really impactful. Like you can even just play during your lunchtime. And so yeah, everything that I've talked about today, it's all in this repository. Everything is cited with like the original sources on there. And finally, I promise we actually have a Lunch and Learn series. Um, and one of the topic, it's about like myths and misconception, and also like what anti-racism works look like for immigrant and migrant sex workers. So if you have time, you can also take a look, but I know it's a Pacific time, so we say lunch and learn, and it might actually be like a later snack and
Afternoon tea.
yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for sharing about some of the things that Swan is up to, and please do everybody check out Swan's website. Read more up about the current process for law reform, and you can also join myself during our upcoming Sex Work 101 to 103 series, which will start next week. You can register for that on our website. Otherwise, if folks do have any questions that they want to ask very last minute, then please do. But we hope that you learned something. And thank you so much, Kelly, for coming and chatting, um, and for giving us your time today. And thank you all for coming and listening. And we hope you have a really good rest of your day. I'm
Thank you.
gonna stop. Oh, sorry, Kelly, go for it.
No, I was just trying to say thank you for the invitation, and I'm gonna put my email there too. Like if anyone has question, and you can also email me. There's never stupid questions. So you can just if you want to chat, just send me an email. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm gonna stop the recording in case anybody does want to ask any questions privately.